Hi, I'm Dan Barker, and welcome to Free Thought Matters, a production of the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, and Dan and I are co-presidents of FFRF, the nation's largest association of atheists and agnostics, working since 1978 to keep state and church separate. You can join FFRF today or ask for information and a free copy of our newspaper at ffrf.org.
Joining us today in the Stephen Yuill Friendly Atheist Studio is Larry Shapiro. Larry is a professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He teaches courses in the philosophy of psychology and the psychology of the mind. Larry is author of several books, including Zen and the Art of Running, The Mind Incarnate, Arguing About the Mind, and most recently, The Miracle Myth, Why Belief in the Resurrection and the Supernatural is Unjustified. So welcome to Free Thought Matters, Larry.
Thanks for having me here. I really admire your organization and what you do for it.
So I take it from your book about running that you are a runner.
I am a runner. I'm not the runner I used to be, but I still run 3 or 4 times a week, and love the opportunities in Madison for running through nature and through urban areas.
And Zen, why Zen?
Zen was an interest because religion intrigues me, and what I like about Buddhism is that it's in many ways a religion not in any ordinary sense. I don't think it has theistic commitments. I think it's very receptive to science. There's important work being done right here at UW that shows the positive effects of meditation on health.
But you're also playing off the book Zen and the Motorcycle, right?
That's right.
There
are a number of books in a series, Zen and the blank.
Zen and this, yeah.
Yeah, Zen and the Art of whatever. And I was invited to write one on running.
Well, that's great. But you didn't have to run to get here. You just live a block away from our building.
Just down the street. Yeah, that's right.
So that was nice to have you here in Madison and have you so close.
It's nice to have the organization so nearby.
So before we talk about miracles and why you don't believe in them, can we talk a little bit about the mind, because that's something that you teach about and have written books about.
Sure. So there's been this deep question about the relationship between the mind and the brain that goes back centuries, if not longer. Descartes was probably one of the most prominent philosophers to begin to investigate how the mind and the brain interact with each other, or the mind and the body. And Descartes, writing in the 17th century, thought that minds were immaterial, spiritual, non-physical substances, and bodies and brains are, of course, material substances. They're located in space and in time, and they have mass. And so Descartes was left with this puzzle about how to understand how something immaterial like the mind can cause the body, which is physical, to do things, and how something like the body, which is physical, can have effects or influences on the mind. And most contemporary philosophers of psychology, philosophers of mind, have abandoned that picture that Descartes established, and now think of the mind as a physical thing. It's the brain in some sense, and then it's trying to understand the sense in which it is the brain that philosophers are puzzling over now.
Now, don't some philosophers say that mind is just a way of describing what the brain is doing? It's a function of, just like digestion describes what the stomach is doing. It's not a thing all by itself. So how do you fall in that?
So there are philosophers like John Searle who have taken that view, where John Searle thinks that minds are to the brains as digestion is to the gut, something like that. But that's to say that what the gut does is cause digestion. But it sounds funny to say that what the brain does is cause a mind, because then you end up thinking of the mind as, once again, distinct from the brain. So one way to understand what the mind is to think of it as somehow realized or constituted by the brain, just like a bunch of gears and springs might constitute a watch. Neurons and their connections might constitute the mind.
Or another way of looking at it is that it's something spiritual and transcendent that God is putting inside of our skulls, right?
Right. I
Which
think
you
that's
don't
an
adhere
absurd
to.
way of thinking about it. It's a way that generates all sorts of questions about how the mind causes the body to do things. It also generates questions about how we might empirically investigate the mind. If it's spiritual, then it's not the kind of thing that lends itself to our MRI machines, for instance, that give us insight into psychology.
And where does the soul, the religious concept of the soul, fall in all of this?
Descartes thought of the mind and as the soul as equivalent. As a materialist, I don't think there are souls. I think souls have no role to play in our understanding of human psychology or human behavior.
Well, here.
Well, you know, an interesting question is, it's fascinating that if there is this thing, whatever, transcendent or you know, called a soul or a mind, it's interesting that it just follows your cranium around. I mean, it just follows the skull around. When you walk across the room, it sticks with it as it's like glued. It's obviously not a thing all by itself. It's obviously part of this physical organ that we have.
There are lots of problems when thinking about minds as being souls. If souls don't exist in space and time, they don't have a location. There, so many common ways of thinking about the soul, I think, have been generated by movies and books in which souls are depicted as sort of spirits that are just a little dimmer version of the person, but they walk through walls, they hover, but that can't be what souls are, because souls are invisible. They don't take up any space at all. Yeah.
Well, that's the old model. That's what I used to preach when I was in the pulpit.
Right.
The spirit, and that you could have an out-of-body experience. Your brain, your whatever you call it, soul could be somewhere else.
Yeah,
you know?
Right.
But
in fact, it's funny you mentioned out-of-body experiences. I was recently in a debate with a Christian apologist named Michael Licona, and he was citing as evidence for why one might take seriously miracles and the supernatural a number of reports in which people have testified to having out-of-body experiences. They'll be on a surgical table and they'll be looking down at the surgery and noticing things that they couldn't possibly have noticed. And I think none of this stuff has actually been confirmed, but what I find interesting is that there are now scientists and philosophers who have been able to induce out-of-body experiences. So it turns out that yes, there are out-of-body experiences, but there's a perfectly natural explanation for these things.
You're hearing the noise, and your body and your mind is making up the picture to go with it, for example.
You can actually be experimentally induced to think that you are actually 10 feet in front of you, that your point of view shifts to a different position. It's really clever, ingenious experimental work.
Now, you have written a book, it is your most recent book, I believe, about the resurrection.
That's right.
And what prompted that, and what is the thesis of that?
A number of things prompted it. One was a kind of philosophical bewilderment that so many people would believe something for which there's so little evidence. And as a philosopher who's committed to thinking that if I have a conclusion about something, I have justification for believing it, I wanted to try to convince people that here's a conclusion that you don't have justification for believing, and that was kind of philosophers get irritated by credulity when it's not deserved. Another was more political. I'm really frightened and upset by the religious dominance in politics right now, and this was written in part as a way to vent my frustrations. And I know I'm not going to change many minds, but when I give lectures about this material at Christian universities, inevitably one or two people will write to me afterwards and say, "I never thought I'd meet an atheist. It meant so much to me to hear from an atheist and to see that atheists don't have horns," that kind of thing. And so writing this book has given me an opportunity to interact with devout Christians or people who are in a devout Christian culture and touch some of them in what I regard a positive way.
Well, there could be many positive ripple effects from that kind of thing. So you are getting a lot of invitations to speak to Christian groups? Or?
I've had several in the last couple of years, yeah.
Well, you debated John Lennox, the mathematician, and Michael Licona you've debated, and both of them use the resurrection of Jesus as positive evidence for the existence of God. And they go into the documents and the historical stories, and they use all these different approaches, I'm sure you know, but the cumulative argument. But there was an empty tomb. We know that from history. So how do you respond to these people like Lennox and Licona?
There are a few arguments and a few distinctions that I think are really important to keep in mind when talking about the so-called historicity of the Gospels. One thing is that we have an argument dating back from David Hume, which asks us to when thinking about testimony on behalf of something really improbable, like a resurrection, Hume asks us to weigh the possibility that that testimony is false against the possibility that this really improbable event actually happened. So when wondering about the resurrection, we have to think to ourselves, well, a dead man coming back to life is really improbable. As far as we know, it's happened only once if we think that it's happened at all. And on the other hand, we know that testimony is often wrong, especially testimony dating back 2,000 years from people who are very superstitious and believe lots of things we know to be false. And so on those grounds, we should favor the view that the resurrection never actually occurred. It's less probable than that there was an error in the testimony.
And especially a testimony that has an agenda.
Yes.
Because those writers were not just objective writers, oh, this happened. In fact, John even says, these things are written that you might believe. He had a purpose in writing these things down. So, you know, maybe something happened, but maybe it was exaggeration.
Yeah.
Maybe they just misinterpreted something.
Maybe he was a charismatic cult leader whose members thought, we have to make up something because he never came out of that tomb.
So you say the probability of the resurrection is very, very low. And it's good to hear that you don't say it's zero, because there's always some probability. What about historical Jesus? That probability is low, but how low do you think that is?
From what I know, and I'm not an historian, there was an historical Jesus. I talked to some historians who think that maybe we know enough about this historical Jesus to write a document of about 11 pages or so on what we know about him.
Yeah.
But here's a distinction that's really important to keep in mind, too. Suppose that the evidence reaches a point where we start to think, okay, maybe Jesus died and came back to life. We still have no evidence at all about why he came back to life. So this is something I've pushed Michael Licona on. Even if you grant that Jesus died and came back to life, this isn't evidence that God exists. Maybe he had been cured of death by some weird potion that someone spilled into his mouth.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous, but is it more ridiculous than God bringing him back to life?
Well, we have to take a break, Larry, and after the break, our show will come back to life. We're talking with the author and the philosopher Larry Shapiro, who teaches at the University of Wisconsin, right here in Madison, where our show is produced. So stay tuned. After the break, we'll come back and talk about why the resurrection is improbable.
I'm Ken, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. For me, it was never a choice whether to become an atheist or not. It was just more of a natural progression. I never had an aha moment or any precise moment in time where I decided to suddenly switch gears. I was raised in a somewhat religious environment. I was a pretty liberal Lutheran family, but it just seemed the more I grew and learned and basically matured, I just kept, looking at the person to the left of me and to the right of me, and, I couldn't believe more and more that, other people were actually believing this stuff, whereas I was, progressing into a mindset that this is entirely not true. And it was never, you know, a decision for me. It was just a natural occurrence. And so I, you know, think of myself as a natural atheist if there ever was one.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist, and I'm alarmed by the intrusions of religion into our secular government. That's why I'm asking you to support the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics, working to keep state and church separate, just like our founding fathers intended. Please support the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
Welcome back to Free Thought Matters, and we're talking with Professor Larry Shapiro about his book, The Miracle Myth, Why Belief in the Resurrection and the Supernatural is Unjustified. So tell us some more about your very, to most people, controversial thesis.
The thesis is that justification requires a certain amount of evidence, a certain amount of warrant, and that's simply not there when it comes to beliefs about the resurrection. Another point about evidence that's worth making is that the less probable that some event occurs, the better the evidence needs to be in order to convince us that we have good reason to believe it.
And that's kind of like, to paraphrase David Hume, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence.
Yeah.
And yet we have very unextraordinary evidence, do we not, about the resurrection?
It's terrible evidence. Here's something just to make the point intuitive. Suppose that your daughter comes home from school one day and says that her friend Lisa had a birthday party in class. And you might think, well, birthday parties happen, that's not so incredible. I'll believe her. And then she comes home the next day and says, sorry, I missed school today because aliens abducted me. Okay, we have the same person telling us something. The first time about the birthday party, we believe her. Second time, she might be just as reliable as she was the first time, but because what she's reporting is so less probable, we're not justified in believing her. Now, when an historian says, a civil war happened, and here's my evidence for it, and provides you with physical material, belt buckles, bullets, bayonets, and documentation and photographs, you might think civil wars are kind of unusual, but this amount of evidence convinces me that it really happened. Well, now go to the resurrection, which is far less probable than a civil war. So the evidence should be even better for believing in a resurrection than it should be for believing a civil war if you're going to be justified in believing it. Now compare the evidence that we have for Jesus' resurrection against the evidence we have for a civil war, or the dropping of a bomb, or the destruction of Pompeii. These events are all more probable than a resurrection, and the evidence we have for them is all better. What we should want is better evidence for the resurrection, and that's exactly what we don't have.
And what would a fundamentalist Christian claim is the evidence for a resurrection? I mean, is that all just straight out of the Bible?
Some of it is straight out of the Bible. They also say things like, well, why would so many people have believed this if it didn't happen? Which is just ludicrous. People believe lots of things for very little reason.
Anatole French said, 10 million people believe an absurd thing, it is still an absurd thing. It's that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, right.
That's not really evidence.
Right, that's not evidence at all.
It's evidence that's powerful.
Yeah, it's right. It's evidence that this is a really appealing doctrine. And come on, if someone said, hey, you can die and then go to heaven for eternity, that's something I would like to believe if I could. Another thing that Christian fundamentalists often say is there were martyrs. There were people who died for they sacrificed themselves, so strong was their commitment and their belief that Jesus rose from the dead. To which I respond, we have religious fanatics who are blowing themselves up every day for religious beliefs that they believe, and that's no evidence at all that what they believe is true.
So the New Testament documents do count as some kind of evidence because they're there. Those are stories that some people told.
Right.
So your point is that they're not good evidence. They're evidence, but they don't rise to the level where we would justify that we have a belief in them.
Right. They are evidence, but they're nothing like the evidence we have for something like the destruction of Pompeii, and the evidence we need for something as unlikely as Jesus' resurrection has to be better than the evidence we'd have for the destruction of Pompeii, I'm saying.
So, Larry, you are an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
So are they going to say, well, you just have your own agenda, just like the Christians have their agenda?
Yes, they do say that, in fact. And that's an ad hominem.
Right.
So they're not responding to my argument. They're basically thinking the argument is bad because I'm bad. In all of my interactions with fundamentalists and discussion about my books, none of them have responded to my actual arguments. What they point out is historical evidence that I didn't appreciate, or they point out errors in what they regard as my description of the historicity of the Gospels. But these are all non sequiturs. The core of my arguments are based on sort of probabilistic reasoning in some cases, and they are not responding to that at all.
So when I pointed out that the gospel writers had an agenda, was that also an ad hominem?
Yes, that is an ad hominem.
Yeah.
Although it might make their extraordinary claims a little bit more suspicious.
Yeah.
Right, if when you know that they want to prove something they already believe.
Yeah.
They're trying to say that. And you're not on record saying, I'm here to prove the truth of atheism. And, you're not going that far overboard to admit you're...
In fact, I'm not even saying that I'm trying to show that the resurrection did not happen. I'm just trying to say that you're not justified in believing that it happened.
Well, David Hume said miracles do not happen.
I'm not sure he said that. I think he said that you shouldn't believe that they happen.
Yeah. Well, because a miracle by definition is so unusual that it has to be, otherwise it's not a miracle. A miracle is supposed to be this shockingly, wow, this, because if people were routinely raising from the dead from the cemeteries in Madison, Wisconsin, well, then the resurrection of Jesus would be no big deal, right?
That's right.
So the very fact that it is unusual is what puts it at odds with history, because historians have to assume the laws of nature today are the same as the laws of nature back then. And you make that point in your writings.
That's right. That's right. There are philosophers, Malebranche, who I think you were probably just discussing with Steve Nadler, thought that everything that's caused in the world is caused by divine intervention. So there's one sense, if a miracle is divine intervention, then every single thing that happens was a miracle for Malebranche. And I think that trivializes the understanding of miracles that Christians have today.
So this show is a miracle.
Everything is a miracle.
Wow.
Well, it's a miracle that we got it on the air. Because there's still a lot of...
You mean a lowercase m miracle.
Discrimination against non-believers and our views. But so aside from this whole question of the book that you've written about the probability of the resurrection, can you briefly tell us how you became an atheist? Or I know you were born that way, but what happened?
I was raised in a kind of secular Jewish household where there was some attention paid to my cultural traditions, but my parents never were believers, as far as I can tell. They think they were raised, they were well educated. They were raised by their parents who were scientists, and I think, although my grandmother was an Orthodox Jew, but I think my parents never believed, and I was not raised to believe. And now that I've had a lot of training in how to think and analyze arguments, as a philosopher does, I'm even further from believing than I was as a child.
Do you know many Jews in the Jewish community? Assuming you're part of it, I don't know if you are. How many of them might actually be true believers in a God? Like here in Madison, I wonder how many.
So I have quite a few Jews in my circle of friends, none of whom believe in God.
None of them, huh?
And they belong to the conservative temple, which is kind of more committed to Judaism than, say, a Reform temple. And I'm quite sure that many congregants in the conservative temple are atheists.
So it's more of an ethnic, familial sense of community than it has anything to really do with superstition.
It's an important part of their lives. It's a source of cultural and connectedness to their ancestry. It brings people together. It gives you occasions to celebrate with your loved ones several times a year. So it's a very meaningful thing for these people, and it's meaningful despite not having God at its center.
So you probably like that old joke. What do you call a Jew who doesn't believe in God?
I haven't heard this.
A Jew.
Yeah, that's accurate, at least with respect to my friends.
Well, there have to be. I mean, there's some
Of course.
Lubavitch types in those. I mean, who, you know, the people who put the menorah up in the state capitol. There's some of those Orthodox that actually do believe. So
so the menorah might be going up in the state capitol just to remind people that there are non-Christians in the country.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
it's a striking difference walking down a street in New York City and walking down a street here, where in New York City, everyone's showing a menorah around the holiday season.
So we have about a minute left. Do you have any flack from students at all, believing students in your class?
I don't teach this stuff in my classes. Part of it is because I don't want to deal with the possibility that I'm going to have a state legislator breathing down my neck because I'm saying things that students dislike. I would never present a view, though, because it's my view, but even just trying to present arguments impartially in today's climate is risky.
Well, you did a good job today. Thank you, Larry Shapiro. Larry Shapiro is an author and a professor of philosophy at the University of Madison in Wisconsin. And thank you for watching Free Thought Matters.
Because free thought matters.